Some of the most exciting things about watercolor is its unpredictability. In an earlier video, I showed you two washes that are very controlled. Now I'm going to show you something that is the complete opposite of that. Now I want to get my brush nice and wet. I stir it onto the block of paint, make sure that I got lots of water in there, and then I dab it onto the palette, and I'm creating a puddle of burnt sienna paint that I can then use. And I want to take it and just touch the paper and let it spread. This is where the water really does its thing, and I have very little control, but it's also where watercolor gets really interesting. So this effect is looking very soft, but if I take it directly from the cake to the painting, instead of rinsing it with water first, I'm going to get a stronger look. A little bit more paint on there. There we go. And that is going to be a little bit stronger. So it's dramatic looking. It's a little bit unpredictable. It's important to really play when you do this and don't have an expectation about what it needs to look like. Play around, see what you get. I'm going to set this aside to dry and we'll take a look at it later. Okay, so now I'm going to do another wet into wet wash. So I'm going to brush some water on the surface so I have a nice puddle to work with. Then I'm going to take some paint, some blue, again, and rinse it, add some water to it on the palette and touch it on the surface. Just touch it to see what that's doing. It's really not bleeding out as I'd like to see. So now I'm going to try another color. I'm going to rinse out my brush here, get lots of water on it, and really sort of dip into the red block. So we can dab some of that off into the plastic palette. So my brush is nice and full with lots of paint. There we go. That's kind of what I'm looking for. It's really just taking off like that. It's just bleeding out and the colors are connecting. All right, there, that's starting to be kind of interesting. So I'm going to move that aside a little bit and let that dry in the corner. I could pick up, sometimes you might want to pick up a little bit if it's sort of creeping over a little bit too much, but that might be okay. Let that do its thing. In this next wash, I'm going to sprinkle salt into it to create a texture. And let's try another blue, do another wet in here. We've got all this blue in here, pretty intense. I'll brush that in there. And now I'm going to go with some green, bluish green. Let's see what that. It's a phthalo blue, or phthalo green, so it really does look, they mix together really beautifully. Okay, and this is actually wet enough that it's starting to bow a little bit. And it's a problem because I'm getting this puddling on the edges. So what I can do is I can use my water bottle here. I'm going to spritz the back right here. So now that it's wet on both sides, it literally flattens out and I don't have that buckling problem anymore. So as I add more color, I want it to be even more dramatic. So I'm going to try a different brush. This is a round, and get some more of this phthalo green. And Prussian blue, and work them together. They're just really gorgeous, gorgeous colors together. Kind of gives you a sense of underwater mixture of colors. So if we're thinking underwater, let's do a little bit of salt. What happens if we sprinkle salt into this? We get another texture. Now the salt sucks the water to it. So basically, when it dries, you know these little dark spots where the salt is. It gives it kind of a grittiness, a little bit texture. So I'm gonna set this aside with this one over here, and we'll take a look at that one after it dries as well. And now I'm going to show you how to create a different texture using rubbing alcohol. I'm going to start by spraying the back with water, laying this down, and start with some water first. And I'm going to start dabbing more blues and greens to get a dramatic wash just like I did before. So now that it's ready, I'm going to take some rubbing alcohol, just like you find at the drugstore. And a Q-tip works really well for this, but I'm just going to use what's handy, which is I have a small pointed brush. And just drip that in there, and you get a spot. It's a big splash. It pushes the water away. I'm just dropping it, I'm not touching it. And it gives you some really dramatic action with that. So, wow, that's interesting. So this looks like a good time to set this aside and let it dry. Now that these have had time to dry, let's take a look at them. Now this is the first wash that we did, and as you can see, it's buckling a little bit. Anytime you paint something on one side but not on the other, this is what happens. If I just spritz the back with my water and then lay a paper towel down on the bottom and then on the top and put a book on it, it will dry completely flat. So you don't have to spray the front, just the back, and that will take care of it. So now we can see the wet version and the dry version side by side. Now you can see in the wet version how I've put some of that burnt sienna very heavily in some areas. It's almost like the pigment is floating on top of the water. And the water is sort of running between those areas almost like a river. But as it dried, the burnt sienna seeped into those watery areas and it's made the contrast less visible. Also, as the burnt sienna dries, we become very aware of the pigment and it looks gritty on the surface of the paper, while it's very soft in the wet version. And the blue, which was really noticeable and present in the wet version, has really just kind of slipped to the edges and you just see a trace of it. The little dark edges are what you call a bloom. It's really kind of lovely, but it doesn't have that sense of this river running through it, which was so much fun. So my advice to you is to take some pictures. Take a picture of it when it's wet and take a picture of it when it's dry and then compare those and let those guide you in creating experiments so that you can learn how to create the effect and the look in the washes that you want. Okay, and now here is the second wash we did. And the big picture, basically, the dry version is a little bit lighter. There is one dark spot of red at the top, but in most of the cases, those darker spots have bled and evened it out a little bit. But it's still pretty saturated, so I'm happy with how that came out. Okay, now let's take a look at wash number 3. Now I have had salt effects come out a lot better than this. The salt is not that visible, and I think it was a little dry in patches, so we didn't get a very strong salt effect. But what I'm really pleased with here are the interesting bloom shapes. They're just very intense and, organic looking, and I was using Windsor blue and phthalo green, and I think that the pigments are so strong that I just ended up with a very intense version when it dries. You can use different pigments, you can use certain inks that will give you a lot more intensity when things dry as well. So those are things you should experiment with. Okay, and now here we have wash number 4. And this really is one of my favorite techniques. It's just so fun and so unpredictable. And so you can see what happens is the alcohol pushes the ink away, or the watercolor, and as it dries, the watercolor starts to come back in, so those little blobs that we have on the left have shrunk to much smaller. The Also, the darkest areas that were in the wet have moved to other areas in the dry because it's water, and where the water goes, that's where the paint goes. That's part of the excitement of it. So there may be some things you like in the wet version, but there's also things I like better in the dry version. It actually stayed very intense in color. So I hope this gives you some ideas of things you can try in your studio and have some fun with. Thank you very much for watching.